The infamous 3DO has a sequel console.
If you are a gaming connoisseur, you might recall the existence of the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, an ambitious one-time next-generation console launched with a bold vision and a business model unlike anything else in the industry. Conceived by 3DO company founder Trip Hawkins, the plan wasn't to manufacture consoles directly, but to innovatively license the hardware to third-party manufacturers. Going in this direction, Hawkins genuinely believed that this decentralized strategy would revolutionize console gaming and put 3DO at the top of the heap in a dominant position. After all, the console would not just be manufactured uniquely, but it was damn powerful too, with the system's core technology developed by Dave Needle and RJ Mickle of the New Technologies Group being designed to be cutting edge for the time.
But technical ambition alone wasn't enough to save it.
Despite all its promise, the 3DO's potential was ultimately squandered by a catastrophic cocktail of corporate misfires, most notably its ludicrous price point, an uninspired game library, and a market that was already dangerously saturated. And just to rub salt in the wound, Sony and Sega soon crashed the party with the PlayStation and Saturn, slamming the door on any hopes of 3DO dominating the living room permanently. Bearing this in mind, with the 3DO failing to make the impact Hawkins had dreamed of, the future of 3DO consoles didn't just end there, as they would soon plan a return with even bigger aspirations. The goal? To develop the world's most powerful game console and claw back some relevance in an increasingly brutal console war.
I am Lady Decade, and today we're diving into one of gaming history's most fascinating what could have been moments. This is the story of the Panasonic M2, the ill-fated sequel to the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer.
Gaming history, it's bloody weird, isn't it? There are simply so many quirky pieces of hardware out there, often with libraries containing all sorts of strange oddities that are desperate to be explored. But what's even cooler, whether you are after something completely weird or looking to play the latest smash hit, using my affiliate link via the pinned comment means you can get up to 90% off thousands of games. This includes 29% off Monster Hunter Wilds and 33% off the off-the-wall Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii. Easily the best release from this year so far. So, treat yourself to some bargains and support my work simultaneously. It's a win-win for everyone. By the mid-90s, it had become painfully obvious that the once promising 3DO was, frankly, a dead duck. Like with any project spiralling towards failure, those involved began scrambling to turn things around, and so Dave Needle and RJ Mickle returned to what they did best: engineering new, more advanced hardware in a last-ditch effort to breathe new life into the 3DO brand. The first step in this next-gen resurrection came in the form of a modest hardware upgrade, at least initially. To try to rectify issues, Needle and Mickle announced that they were developing an add-on chip for the original 3DO console, featuring a custom PowerPC microprocessor designed to inject new life into the aging system.
But as with most things in gaming history, what started off as a simple expansion soon snowballed into something far more ambitious. When the 1995 Electronic Entertainment Expo rolled around, plans had evolved dramatically. It was at this very event that the 3DO company revealed that they weren't just tinkering with add-ons, they were astonishingly building an entirely new console. This standalone successor would be known as the M2, and in a crazier twist, a working prototype was even demonstrated on the show floor. As for anyone who was still clinging on to their original 3DO units, there was a faint glimmer of hope, as the company clarified that the PowerPC add-on chip was still intended for release, meaning early adopters hadn't necessarily poured their hard-earned cash straight down the toilet into a system that support was intended to be dropped for. A rare mercy, I guess.
As for how this new device was set to be rolled out, initially the M2 was intended to follow the same distribution model as its predecessor. This meant that multiple manufacturers would produce the hardware under license. Panasonic and Gold Star were two of the names reportedly lined up to bring the new system to market.
But as you might expect to hear, this plan didn't last long.
In another plot twist, it was soon announced that the 3DO company had sold the M2 technology outright to Panasonic. This deal gave Panasonic exclusive manufacturing rights, effectively scrapping the original multi-vendor approach that the 3DO had become synonymous with. Essentially, instead of having a decentralized ecosystem, the M2 would now be produced and distributed in a much more traditional top-down fashion. This sudden shift in strategy sent shockwaves through the developer community. Many studios that had initially shown interest in the M2 began to panic. With only one manufacturer and no guarantee of a large install base, developers feared the new system could end up with even fewer owners than the original 3DO, a scenario that made many reconsider whether it was worth the time or resources to learn the intricacies of this new hardware at all, especially considering how common hardware flops had been in recent years. Following Panasonic's acquisition of the M2, things would soon take an even more intriguing turn. It's been reported that in the mid-90s, discussions began of a potential partnership with Sega, with the aim of transforming the M2 into the successor to the Sega Saturn rather than just the 3DO. And honestly, that's not even remotely surprising when you consider how many almost happened stories exist in Sega's chaotic history. If there's one thing that Sega excelled at in the 90s, it was nearly doing brilliant things before setting fire to them. What is even crazier is that, according to Trip Hawkins himself, the proposed deal between Sega and Panasonic was practically a done deal, allegedly only falling apart at the very last minute in mid-1996. This means that if Hawkins is to be believed, we came dangerously close to a timeline where the M2 became the Saturn II. But as with most things involving Sega, it all fell apart spectacularly.
So, marketing plans are one thing, but how powerful was this platform supposed to be?
According to 3DO spokesperson Omid Kordestani, the M2 was capable of generating a blistering 1 million polygons per second with all graphical features turned off, or around 700,000 polygons per second with them switched on. For the time, this was seriously impressive. Even more tantalising was the fact that at one stage, Panasonic had plans to include a built-in DVD player in the M2, something that would have beaten the PlayStation 2 to the punch by several years. Considering how many people now point to the DVD playback as one of the PS2's greatest secret weapons in the console war, it's fascinating to think how different history could have been if the M2 had got there first. Would the public have embraced it in the same way? Or did that particular lightning bolt only strike once? Backing up the bold claims around the M2's DVD potential was 3DO's Senior Vice President of Hardware Engineering, Toby Farrand, who went on record stating that the system was designed knowing that we could make it a DVD-capable player. In the mid-90s, the idea of a super-powered game console that could also double as a DVD player wasn't just forward-thinking, it was borderline science fiction for most consumers. Naturally, this sent the gaming press into a complete frenzy. One standout example came from Next Generation magazine, who was so enamoured with the M2's promise that they awarded it 4 out of 5 stars, despite the small detail that it hadn't actually launched yet and, spoiler alert, never would. What's more is that the publication raved about the system, describing it as several times more powerful than any other console on the market. They also praised the 3DO company's efforts to attract third-party developers, claiming the M2 had officially crossed over from being a dreamy pile of spec sheets to tangible, workable hardware that developers could actually believe in.
But let's be honest here, hype only gets you so far.
By the time the 1996 Electronic Entertainment Expo rolled round, just 1 year after the M2 had previously wowed attendees with its prototype demo, something felt off. The console was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a lone Panasonic spokesperson took to the stage, offering an ominously vague update. Apparently, the company was no longer sure how or even if they wanted to use the M2 technology moving forward. The question wasn't just whether the M2 would still be a console, but whether Panasonic even wanted to stay in the home gaming business at all. Things certainly were not looking good for 3DO's small fandom. What's even worse is that by the tail end of 1996, things still weren't looking much clearer. Despite the initial excitement, no firm release date for the M2 had materialised. Yet oddly, third-party publishers continued to boast about the system's supposed superiority, claiming it was significantly more powerful than the Nintendo 64, which at the time was being proudly marketed as the most powerful games console on the planet.
But behind the curtain, things weren't nearly as optimistic.
Electronic Gaming Monthly summed up the situation rather poetically in one of their reports from the time, stating that some months it seems the boat is still afloat. Rumours crop up of a public showing, new demos come out, or a Matsushita official doles out some tantalising hints. Other months it seems the boat has capsized, with developers scrambling to get off the boat whilst they still can. That quote pretty much says it all. Confusion reigned. Depending on which outlets you were reading or which executive was whispering into which journalist's ear, the M2 was either on the brink of a glorious launch or circling the drain entirely. No one seemed to know what was really going on, and the trickle of vague updates and conflicting rumours only added to the fog. Almost expectedly, by this point, the inevitable happened. After years of grandiose promises, tech demos and speculation, Panasonic officially pulled the plug on the M2. By mid-1997, the once hyped next-generation console was cancelled, unceremoniously shelved before it had even had the chance to hit the market.
Which, of course, raises the question as to why.
Panasonic's official reasoning for pulling the plug on the M2 was, on the surface, fairly straightforward. They reportedly felt it would be futile trying to compete with the likes of the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation, two consoles that, by that point, were already dominating the market with critically acclaimed high-selling games. Panasonic, on the other hand, lacked the in-house development experience and first-party software support necessary to go toe-to-toe with industry heavyweights. And rather than bleed money trying to claw out a foothold, they simply walked away. But while this excise seems more than valid, what makes this all particularly fascinating is just how late in the game that decision seems to have come. After all, the M2 wasn't just a vague idea floating around a boardroom, it had already entered its pre-launch marketing phase. Flyers had been printed and distributed, advertising the upcoming console to potential consumers and partners. These promotional materials even featured early screenshots of prospective launch titles, complete with gameplay imagery from now cancelled M2 games. That's how far along these things had come before the axe fell. In fact, some of those games had already been shown to the public as early as 1995, and titles like Clay Fighter 3, Descent, and Iron Blood were all in development for the system. Iron Blood, incidentally, would later resurface, albeit in a cut-down form, as Iron and Blood on the Sony PlayStation. There was also D2, a planned sequel to Kenji Ino's cult horror game D, which was being developed specifically for the M2, and let's not forget Battlesport, which Studio 3DO had claimed would also be getting an M2 enhanced version. However, on the M2 at least, they would all be gone before they ever had a chance to shine. And it wasn't just a handful of games either, there were loads of titles that went into M2 development. In fact, according to the publication Ultra Games, at one point there were as many as 80 games in simultaneous development for the platform. That's a staggering number for a console that never even launched. To put the hype and misfiring into perspective, both Capcom and Konami, two of the most influential developers of the era, had pledged support for the M2. So this wasn't just an obscure studios dabbling with the hardware, major players were getting involved. This was no fringe project, the M2 was gearing itself up to be a serious contender in the next-gen race.
The fact it was cancelled is tragic in a way.
Reflecting on the M2's demise, Trip Hawkins later remarked that the M2 was a very powerful 64-bit design with a lot of RAM and a big disk drive. Perhaps, like the 3DO, it was slightly ahead of its time because of the component costs, but this is the design direction where the industry is headed. And, in fairness, he had a point. Much of what M2 was aiming to do did eventually become industry standard. It just got there about a decade too early. Still, the failure of the console didn't stop 3DO from cashing in. When they sold the M2 tech to Panasonic, they pocketed a cool $100 million. That sale alone was enough to push the 3DO company into profitability for the first time ever, reporting a $1.2 million net income in the first quarter of 1996. So, while the M2 may have flopped from a gaming perspective, the company that birthed it actually made a killing. As for Panasonic, well, they weren't about to let $100 million worth of tech go entirely to waste. Instead of scrapping the hardware altogether, they found some truly bizarre alternative uses for it. In Japan, the M2 architecture ended up being repurposed for automatic teller machines, or ATMs to you and me, and believe it or not, coffee vending machines.
Yes, really.
In fact, from the year 2000 onwards, the technology would also find new life in the interactive kiosk market. But what is much cooler is that in addition to vending machines and kiosks, the M2's strange post-console life didn't stop there. Planet's Web Incorporated began offering software that allowed the M2 to be used as an internet appliance. So, while the tech didn't end up revolutionizing home gaming, it wasn't completely abandoned either. It was just quietly repurposed into far less exciting forms than originally imagined. But the system's console legacy still has one more interesting chapter to cover. Over the years, M2 development kits and prototype units have become highly sought-after collector's items, now residing in the hands of a lucky few. Perhaps the closest things to come to a commercial M2 console ever released came in the form of Panasonic's interactive media players, which launched around 1998. According to videogameconsolelibrary.com, these included two models, the M2 FZ21S and the M2 FZ35S. These weren't aimed at gamers, but at professionals working in fields like medicine, architecture, and sales. They weren't exactly PlayStation killers, but they were at least a tangible glimpse at what the M2 hardware could do in a commercial setting, even if it were nowhere near what we were originally promised. The modern internet occasionally throws up new glimpses of what the M2 could have been. For example, in 2010, a fully finished M2 game, IMSA Racing, was made publicly available, proving that at least one title had made it all the way to completion before the plug was pulled. Then, in 2020, the YouTube channel Video Game Esoterica showcased a rare compilation demo disc featuring 12 different titles that were in development for the cancelled M2 platform. It's an amazing time capsule offering a peek into the ghost library of a console that never came to be. So, who knows? Maybe more lost M2 content will continue to surface in the future. If you enjoy weird gaming history, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and if you want huge gaming discounts on thousands of games like Pirate Yakuza or Monster Hunter Wilds, use my affiliate links below. Or if you want to support my work in a more personal way, access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon.